bienvenue à cette session.
Ok. Je vais d'abord expliquer en français aux francophones pour savoir comment on va jongler avec l'interprétation. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'il y a? Il y a un problème technique?
Je ne vois plus l'interprétation.
Ah ben moi, je te vois. Je vois que, voilà, ça y est, c'est parfait.
Ça y est, c'est mieux.
Ah,
je vais lancer l'interprétation.
D'accord.
C'est bon, l'interprétation marche.
Ok, donc pour les participants francophones, je vais ou pas d'ailleurs, parce que ça dépend qui veut suivre la session en français ou en anglais. Donc les panélistes vont parler en anglais et vous pouvez suivre en français parce qu'on a Isabelle avec nous qui va faire l'interprète. Donc certains parmi vous savent déjà comment faire. Le bouton en bas qui est marqué interprétation et vous choisissez le canal français si vous voulez écouter en français et vous choisissez anglais si vous voulez écouter en anglais.
Rien.
Ou vous choisissez rien, dans ces cas vous écouterez en anglais. Donc rapidement, si tout le monde a mis déjà son canal, on va switcher en anglais.
Je réponds aux questions. Si vous avez des difficultés, posez la question dans le chat et je vous aiderai.
Voilà. So, yeah, welcome everybody to this session, which is, the topic is how can African civil society organization can strengthen their financial sustainability? So that is the question of the day. Think on that. 60 minutes, no, 90 minutes, because that is another error I just noticed. This is a 1 hour and a half session. That is 90 minutes and not 1 hour. And I'm sorry because there has been some confusion. So if you cannot stay until the end, that is also fine. But yeah, because it's a deep discussion with many panelists, we have 1 hour and a half. This session will be recorded, and it's also on YouTube in direct, so people can follow also on YouTube. Yeah, so that is about the session, and I am welcoming the panelists. We have Dimitri, and we have Fred Maliasili from Maliasili. We have Charles, who is coming in from Ghana. And I will ask you, if you are not a panelist, to close your video so that we just stay with panelists. That will be much better. So yeah, I was saying Fred coming from US and joining from US and work for Maliasili. Charles is joining from Ghana and work for WATSI. And we have Cesar, who is joining from Kenya and works for KCDF. Dimitri joining from UK and work for Peace Direct. And then we have David, who is our facilitator, joining from South Africa, and who is a OD practitioner. And I hope there will be time for them to speak for themselves. Yeah, why did we choose these panelists? All of them has been doing some work, some research on how civil society organization can strengthen their financial sustainability. And some of them has worked hard on that. That is the case of PCDF, who, yeah, so that is the main point of putting them together. So I leave this space to David, who will bring us into this discussion and talk. Yeah, welcome, David, and the space is for you.
Thank you, Mireille, and welcome to our panelists or our roundtablers, or however you might want to refer to yourself. The topic, as you know, is how can African civil society organizations strengthen their financial sustainability. And we hope that by the end of the session, those of you who've joined us, and welcome to all of you, that there will be a deeper awareness of what really affects financial sustainability and what options are there to current practice What are some different ways of looking at this? And I think our panelists have all got something very powerful to share. I'd like to just ask, as a first step, is for our, I'm going to call you panelists, if that's okay, or roundtablers. If you would just introduce yourself, where you're from, what you do, and why you have something interesting to say about this matter. So just your name, where you're from, what you do, and why you have something interesting to say about this topic. May I start with you, Dimitri?
Sure thing. So my name is Dimitri Katsiras, and I'm a research analyst at Peace Direct. It's a peace-building organization based in the United Kingdom. I'm actually originally from Canada, from where I'm from, if you're asking that. Our organization ran a 3-year program that was funded by USAID's Local Works Department that focuses on the localization agenda, called Facilitating Financial Sustainability. And so that was a sort of 2-pronged approach involving field research and testing and piloting action learning groups in 3 contexts to look at how they can improve their financial sustainability of civil society in their contexts.
Great. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Cesar, may I ask you to go next?
Yeah, so yes.
You're
Thanks a lot. So my name is Cesar from an organization called the Kenya Community Development Foundation. We're based in Kenya, now running into 23 years. And one of the interesting things is that we borrowed a lot from Canadian foundations, which has a longer history of community foundations. But essentially what we do is we were formed to disrupt the way development was done with a lot of resources coming from outside there. And the question was, how can you ensure that organizations in this part of the world have control of the development projects, both from an angle of relevant projects, but also ability to continue beyond the funding periods of many traditional ways of funding. So that's where we are coming from.
Thank you very much, Cesar. You are so welcome. Charles, may I ask you to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. So I work for an organization called the West Africa Civil Society Institute based in Accra, Ghana. And so we are intermediary organization, capacity development institute for civil society. And the reason why we are here today and going to discuss this is because one of the things that we work on is resilience and sustainability of civil society. That is very much key to ensuring that civil society is robust and influential in the West African region. So we cover all the ECOWAS countries, that's 15 countries, plus Cameroon, Chad, and Mauritania.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. And Fred, may I ask you to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be with you all. So my name's Fred Nelson. I am the CEO of Mali Asili. I live in the US, but Mali Asili's work is focused in Eastern and Southern Africa and now Madagascar. And we support local and national organizations that are working on natural resource management, land rights, conservation issues, to provide customized organizational development support in a lot of respects. Share a lot of similarities with our colleagues at Well Grounded in that. And we work now with about 17 partner organizations in Kenya, Tanzania, Namibia, Zambia, and Madagascar. And our role is to help them become stronger so that they can achieve their missions and advance effective, usually community-based natural resource management approaches on the ground, influence policy. And a lot of our work is around helping them to mobilize resources, to fundraise, to develop partnerships, to become more resilient, effective organizations across a wide range of things, but fundraising is really an important part of that.
Great, you're welcome, thank you. And Catherine, you're somewhere? You're not on this screen of mine, but you're somewhere. Kath from Well Grounded. Are you with us?
Hi there. Yes. My name's Kath. I worked with Yola to set up Well Grounded 10 years ago. And so we've been involved working with civil society organisations in the Congo Basin for the last 10 years. And one of the conversations we always have is around the sustainability and durability of the actions of African civil society.
Welcome, Kath. So I did suggest that we will take this in 3 stages. We're clear on the topic, and thought to start with a question around how people see the current situation with CSOs in Africa. Where are the constraints? Where are the potentials? I'm also going to ask people to sort of limit themselves to a certain number of minutes, just so that we can get through everybody. But there'll be 3 stages: is how do you see the current situation, but then also to share the alternatives you found through your research. What have you found? Where is potential around this financial sustainability? And then the third one is, how can CSOs take this up? What are the kinds of, what does it take to take up alternative approaches and alternative ways of building their financial sustainability? So I'm not going to allocate. Can you just start speaking? Anybody who's ready to respond to the question, how you see the current situation with CSOs in Africa now. And you have 2 minutes to just explain a little bit of what you're seeing that's led you in a way to look at alternatives. Anyone want to begin?
Would you mind if I start?
Please, you're most welcome. You're most welcome, Charles. Go ahead.
All right. I know Caesar will be laughing. Hi, Caesar.
Yes, yes.
So, I think for me, it's just to put it in perspective and context now, because we're all going through the COVID situation. But what COVID has done is to actually expose the underlying issues that we have as civil society in Africa, really to bring it out to the fore. And so in terms of our health, if you look at the health of civil society right now, one of the biggest challenges we have is that many of our very good organizations, local organizations or community-based organizations, or what I'll call less resourced NGOs that do important work in disadvantaged communities, are facing a very difficult challenge of survival. Now, that is for a number of reasons that we already know. One of them is because already, if you look at the funding arrangements that we've had, that we experienced in this part of the world, it's very much project-based, it's very much short-term contracts, and it's not really focused on building strong and resilient organizations. So most of the time, if you look at the design by most of donor partners, the focus of sustainability is on projects and not necessarily the sustainability of those who are working in those communities. So if you look at it, just to bring it in perspective, when this COVID happened, right, you notice that many of these organizations have little reserves and basically have no emergency funds to respond to a crisis of this nature. And usually when there's funding for administrative support, usually it's either between 7 or 10% if you have a really good donor partner, right? So this basically has left many organizations with nothing, and really they're facing like a tsunami, like COVID-19 right now. So in terms of financial sustainability, many organizations are in dire straits, right? And then you look at the other flip side, government support. Yes, governments are coming up with stimulus packages, right? But these stimulus packages are usually targeted at private sector or government agencies. There's no stimulus package for the social sector. And I can say basically in almost all African countries, right? So that in itself is also a challenge. And then, of course, we are excessively dependent on external donor funding, right? That's why we are here to talk about alternatives. And because we're excessively dependent, where we're getting our funding from, they have their own issues to respond to. Right now, they are also investing in responding to the COVID challenge. And so that has left a lot of our organizations in even more dire straits. So when you look at sustainability, yes, financial sustainability is dire, but other aspects of sustainability, if you look at operations, if you look at identity, if you look at interventions, are also being called into question right now. So it's a tough time for especially what I will describe as community-based organizations and less resourced NGOs that work in disadvantaged communities. The ones that are actually surviving, I should say, are the bigger national organizations with more supportive infrastructure and more donor support, who are to some extent still keeping it together.
Thank you,
so
Charles.
I'll just start from there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone want to pick up from there? Feel free to contest, to add, and to introduce new thoughts.
I'm sure I can pick up from there.
Go ahead, Dimitri. Thanks.
Sounds great. Obviously, COVID has exacerbated a lot of these structural problems that underpin the lack of financial sustainability across African civil society organizations. But there's also like bigger issues as well that have been longstanding issues, including shrinking civil society space, especially in conflict-affected areas or areas where governments have seen CSOs with suspicion, and that hasn't helped for them to be able to openly fundraise. Especially around certain sensitive issues, around human rights, for instance, and depending on the sector, financial sustainability can really vary. Another element is around the sort of setup or the structure of donors, usually an intermediary organization or an international organization, and a local partner. And a lot of donors have eligibility criteria where they'll only give a certain amount of whatever call for proposals they have, to proposals that include an INGO and a local partner, where the vast majority of the money ends up going into the INGO's pockets for administration fees. And the rest is projectized in project-based activities and less so in core funding or flexible funding structures or mechanisms. Well, just to tie onto that, in the DRC and Uganda, two countries where we did our research, only 5% of the grant making that's done there is allocated to financial sustainability or core organizational resilience and support. So it's a minute amount compared to the total amount of grant making that's done in those two countries. Another issue has to do with organizational culture. So you have a lot of organizations, especially very local organizations, that tend to rely primarily on the persona of a particular leader who helps to drive things forward. And that's very useful in the initial stages. But what ends up happening afterwards is other staff in those organizations might not feel as recognized or as acknowledged. And that leads to a staff retention problem where sometimes egos can clash. And tied to this, organizations that do provide capacity building for various staff run the risk of getting those staff members or personnel being poached by mostly international organizations. So you spend all this time investing in the staff capacity, whether it's financial management, M&E, or so on, and then that person ends up leaving and you go back to square one. So that's an ongoing issue for sustainability. Yeah, I think it's just the sort of narrow prism that people see like what resources can help with financial sustainability, and people tend to see those as primarily only financial and not asset resources or non-financial like community support, dealing with networks and these kind of things that can help build resilience in hard times such as these right now with COVID. So those are some of the issues that I've noticed in our research and that have been exacerbated by the COVID situation, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dimitri. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go
maybe
ahead.
I can also jump in. Yeah, maybe I can also jump in at this stage, and I would want to pick a few key issues, and one of them is the current state of powerlessness by civil societies on this part of Africa, and majority of the attributable reasons are actually historical. Because you see, for very many years, I talked about KCJ being formed 23 years when there was a lot of foreign aid, and people were accustomed to somebody else coming and identifying their problems and solving their problems, including funding. And so getting that paradigm shift is very difficult because one, you have local CSOs who believe that things can only be done when you write a very good proposal to somebody in the UK or somebody else in some other part of the world. And so a lot of investments have been done on M&D frameworks and outright proposals at the expense of how to deliver projects that are relevant to communities. So that's the side of CSOs. But also when you look at the funders, there's also a lot of power and interest. And so very few funders are willing to give you unrestricted funding, either because they don't trust you, or either because you also want to have, it's also an entire ecosystem that is safeguarded. And so very little has been done to invest, and probably we'll be talking about it in the conversation. Very few people are willing to invest in building stronger organizations that are able to muscle their way within their context. So I tend to think, I always say that you blame the CSOs and people on this side, but you also blame people and funders who have traditionally done things in one way. Then the other one is accountability and legitimacy. So in the struggle of creating a space in Africa for CSOs, you are also challenged with accountability issues, because we also have a lot of history of corruption and NGOs using a lot of big cars, doing meetings in big hotels, and a lot of wastage. And so very few people who understand that when you go to fundraise from a wealthy African, somebody who has grown in the context, and they understand, they have seen all the wastage, and so in their mind, they think that civil societies are just non-governmental organizations with a lot of funding from foreign aid. Then there's also a lot of clawback on the space by governments who also see civil society as advocating foreign agendas. And so all this creates a space that has not allowed African CSOs to reemerge and to reinvent themselves in a quicker way as we would anticipate. And so that would be my contribution maybe at this stage.
Thank you, Caesar. Yeah, you're all coming up with a wide range of issues at many levels. Fred or Cass, you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think, just to echo what others are saying, there's the core challenge is kind of a dysfunctional or a disempowering funding ecosystem, right? And a lot of the inherited behaviors and patterns around fundraising and funding, right? So I think it's important to think about this issue both in terms of what are the funding models and how do those support effective civil society organizational growth and impact, and what are the funding models and fundraising practices by civil society organizations that also play into that kind of dysfunction. And I think, others have mentioned kind of the norms around short-term, highly, project or activity-based funding, transactional funding. We kind of distinguish between what are transactional funding relationships and what are, partnership-based funding relationships where you kind of co-invested in work together rather than more transactional project-based funding. And I think funders and civil society organizations all have interest in fixing and improving those models. And I think, there's responsibility on both sides, on the civil society organization side, to think about, well, how do you play into those models? How can you improve your fundraising approaches? I think there's lots of ways of doing that, both in terms of how you think about it, how you think about different funding sources, how you think about your funding portfolio, how you think about and present your work. Because ultimately fundraising is also based on, I think, the vision and the mission and the impact that an organization achieves and that it exists to deliver. So that kind of interconnectivity between your strategy, your communications, your vision and mission, and your fundraising is an important piece of that. And I think we should think, Charles alluded to the challenges of COVID, but COVID is really an opportunity too. It's an opportunity to pressure test the system, right? And the system has a lot of weak points. But I think, our experience too is that organizations that have developed stronger approaches to fundraising and a longer term outlook, and really more of that partnership-based funding approaches rather than a transactional funding approaches, are going to be in a better shape. And we're seeing funders step up and also, I think, question some of the kinds of problematic funding models that we're talking about, and make more flexible funding. And again, we can talk maybe about some of the responses of the funding community during this period, but it's probably an opportunity to disrupt some of the challenges that we're identifying.
Thank you. Thanks. Kat.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the other panelists have covered a lot of important stuff. I'd like to move on to some of the things I've seen change over the last 10 years. One of the challenges that CSOs in the Congo Basin, that's the area I know best, have faced is because people are anxious about funding, they're also wary about collaborating with each other. There's a real kind of divide and rule game quite often going on between CSOs who feel like they're all competing to get access to the same limited pot of money, to put a convincing story to one particular donor. And one thing I've seen changing in it, and it feels really positive, is that there's a bit more thinking about collaboration and building coalitions. So when I first started working with organizations in the sub-region, everybody wanted to do everything. Everybody wanted to cover all the bases so that they could access funding from everywhere. And what seems to be happening with some organizations is they're thinking a little bit more carefully about exactly where their strengths are and how to build on those, and then collaborate with others who can bring in other strengths. And that means they access more sustainable funding, but also they can be learning from each other. So they're building more of a kind of community of practice within CSOs. So to me, that's an interesting direction that some organizations are having the confidence themselves to start collaborating more effectively with each other.
Fabulous. Well, thank you. That's really painted a very big and detailed picture about what you're seeing in the current situation around CSOs. Can I ask you to move a little now toward sharing some of what your creative research, what your research has shown, what alternatives have been emerging as possibilities for the sector around strengthening financial sustainability? And once again, I invite whoever'd like to start to go right ahead.
Okay, I can start.
Thanks, John.
All right. So a lot of the work that we have done is try to document organizations that are using or putting in place alternative funding models. And so we've done that over a period of like 2-3 years, and I've put together a guidebook called the Alternative Funding Models Guidebook, right, which is available online. And the interesting thing about that process has been the kind of models that we have seen that are being piloted, that are being used as innovations. It also depends on what kind of organization you are in terms of your mandate and your approach. So for example, if you're a humanitarian organization, there are certain models that may suit the way you work. Or if you're an advocacy research organization, there's a certain model. If you're service delivery, there are certain models that are much more easy to try to adopt or adapt into your organization. Yeah, so some of the things we've seen is that many organizations now are looking at income generation. So the question is, how do they monetize their expertise? And so a lot of them are, you know, getting into issues of consultancy, asset building, looking at, you know, how do we get an asset that we can use to generate funding. They're looking at issues of how do we, if we're very good at organizing events, is that something that we can sell and become event organizers within the social sector space and get some sort of funding for that. They're looking at crowdfunding, you know, local, you know, looking more within. How do we take advantage of mobilizing funding from our own domestic constituencies? So local fundraising has become something that many organizations are focusing on now, looking at running campaigns to get their own partners to invest in the work that they're doing. So domestic resource mobilization is important, and of course supporting local philanthropy, the infrastructure for local philanthropy in the long term, that will also help. So there's a huge, I believe, diversification agenda that is going on with many organizations that is happening now. I think there's an awareness that there's a need to diversify and also make sure that they balance the funding that they get from, of course, the very well-known institutional funders with funding that they can get from their own domestic constituencies that can help support administrative costs and operations, salaries, etc. So, I mean, these are the things that are happening. But I must also emphasize, and our colleague from Malia Silly said it, that there are many donors that are also changing the way they are funding to flexible. They are doing more flexible funding. And many donors now are not doing activity-specific funding anymore. So they give general support funding. So they look at what they can support and they support your programs. And they give funding for your programs. And then they allow you as an organization to determine how to use that funding in terms of programs. Or they will give administration-specific funding and they allow you to basically use that funding for specifically administrative reasons, which is really something that we should welcome and advocate more for. It's more powerful. It helps organizations to be more sustainable. And then, of course, the issue of long-term partnerships, very important now. I think, and that's the capacities to sustain partnerships and to build partnerships and especially partnerships across, not just within our own space as civil society, but partnerships with the private sector and with government agencies. And there's a lot of opportunities there for non-cash support, but also funding, but mostly non-cash support, exchange of expertise and other opportunities. So yeah, those are some of the things that we've seen are happening right now with many organizations. But I must confess, the ones that have been successful are normally service delivery organizations, successful in terms of transitioning into alternative models. Yeah.
And because they've got services that they could perhaps charge for, is that one of the reasons?
Exactly, services that they could monetize. The human rights, social justice organizations find it a bit more difficult in terms of that transition. It's possible, but that transition is a bit more challenging for the human rights organization.
Thanks, Charles.
So maybe I can come next, and maybe before I say what I wanted, perhaps to just emphasize that it is true, human rights is difficult until you begin reworking the mentality of the population to begin appreciating the correlation between human rights work and overall development outcomes, which is very challenging. But maybe for me, maybe I will take an approach of just sharing the story of Kenya Community Development Foundation as a perspective. And so when we were formed around 23 years or so, I earlier said that we came at a time when it was very easy to write a proposal and get funding. But of course, there was a lot of white elephant projects that were just done for the sake of it. There was no participation of communities and all those stuff. And so KCDF, that was an opportunity. But when we came, we decided to use a philosophy of using less to achieve more, and also a philosophy of ensuring that we never provide a fee, but you kind of work with communities to ensure that they're able to fish, they're able to safeguard the fishing waters. I know that's a popular saying in Africa, but really we took it to practice. And one of the first things that we did was to begin building an endowment fund. And the good thing with such a mechanism is that it allows you to negotiate with funders, and there are very few of those. I can, if I was to mention, I don't even think I can get to 10 of serious funders who will be able to challenge themselves to such innovative models. And so we've been increasingly building endowment funds, mobilizing resources, but so that we are not selfish, we've also invited other community organizations to join us in building the endowment fund. And the idea is that communities are also able to do local fundraising initiatives and consolidate the funds that then are managed within the framework of the KCDF endowment fund. And by doing that, we are also able to get tax exemptions, which ensures that whatever we get from the endowment is able to push us a little bit further. We began early. Today, we can be able to do very small projects, not necessarily the big ones, but that is a step in the right direction. The next one was also, and I'm saying this because these are potential areas for different PSOs. The next one was doing investment. So we have some holding companies, and it is still work in progress. We began that approach around 10 years or 8 years or so. It's very challenging, but you kind of then need to ensure that your governance structure is so strong and separated, so that you don't have the foundation and the investments commingling, because then you open another particular box for accountability issues. But then it means that whatever income we get from our investments, we are able to plow back into the foundation. The other thing that we've done actively is asset building. We've developed an office block that we are adding to different civil society organizations and other organizations, and we get grants. I can tell you that that has been very instrumental in ensuring that we significantly lower our operational costs, because it means money from the rent can offset some of the costs. We don't have to worry about whether we are going to have a place where we are going to have a. So all those are a mix of things that are important, but again, getting investors and funders who are going to invest in you in such things then requires a high level of accountability, trust, networking, and all those things. Then the other one is a local fundraising, where we have been, and it is difficult. We are now surpassing the 20% mark of local fundraised resources. But you see, it is very slow. It needs a lot of funders. We had a very good funder. We are very lucky. We have had several 2 or 3 funders who have been very good, who have invested in ensuring that we begin building a department of local fundraising. You invest because, and in the initial years, we were making losses. So then the last one that I will talk about is consultants, and I think Charles has captured that, where we are also using part of our resources, part of our human capital resources to do consultancy for other organizations, and we are able to earn a little bit of income that then again helps us to lower our admin cost, or we are able to use it for our charity work. So the idea is it is slow, but it takes a mindset of communities to begin challenging themselves to get more involved, and it also begin challenging funders. One of the difficult things that we've done is that while many organizations will run to, when you have a very big budget and you call it band rate, yeah. I've seen organizations that will go to big hotels to do conferences because you want to comply with the budget. But for us, we'd rather tell the funder that we did this, we met all the obligations of the project, there's 10 million that is left. We propose that if we can do with this money ABCD. And most funders will listen because they can already see that you delivered on what was your mandate. So in very few cases have we been told to return money, but we also ensure that we retain a high degree of accountability so that for whatever we say we will do, we do.
Thank you. So that's an interesting case study of actually what you've done and what you've tried and tested. So thank you for that. What about some of the research that you've been doing, Dimitri or Fred? Would either of you like to just share a little bit of what you found in different ways? Whoever wants to go.
I mean, it will build upon what Charles had covered in his intro to this question. But yes, there are some donors that are adopting more flexible funding structures, especially around unrestricted general support or core support that's intended for strengthening organizations. And this is where the grantees can determine their own plans for organizational strengthening based on their needs and priorities. But that's not just strictly donors and funders, but also some intermediary organizations who can come up with, smaller grants with smaller funds to be able to top up on existing programs that organizations are doing. So in my organization, what we've done, for instance, we've had this awards called Tomorrow's Peace Builders, where people can submit short applications about what kind of promising initiatives that they're already developing. And then we just, disperse, about a 10K grant to be able to support that program over the next year. Or most recently, we launched a digital inclusion initiative, recognizing the added difficulties of working under COVID conditions. And that's where it's like quick impact projects where we kind of give short disbursement micro grants to organizations to top up on some of their needs, whether it's a laptop or things like that, in order to be able to do their work, but rather online digitally versus in person because of social distancing measures. But that's also affecting how sometimes local philanthropies is shaping in different contexts where donors and funders and international governments or the international community more generally, are supporting the strengthening of local funders in certain contexts that can be, hub organizations and so on, to be able to disperse grants themselves without having to depend on the international funding structure that's in place. I did mention about social capital, and that's actually still quite a relevant, other source that of funding that other organizations can get, and that's like community support. And you can't underestimate how important that is. And then, of course, dealing with networks, collective action is actually very useful to be able to pool your resources together and build your strength. Beyond that, another interesting thing that came out of the research is around certain organizations' organizational structure when it came to allowing certain staff members to be contracted out temporarily to provide services for as a consultancy. And so they would come up with an arrangement where that person would, in a time when they didn't have much going on, that person can be outsourced to another organization, provide some consultancy service, and then a portion of those funds are reverted back into that organization, so that both the individual can gain more experience and develop their capacities, but also the organization is getting a source of funding coming back. And then Charles really talked about non-financial assets and the importance of that. So in some cases, organizations that were able to properly adopt social enterprise models by having a donation of land or a certain property, they can then turn that into, for instance, a hostel or things like that to generate income to fund their other activities that are more difficult to fundraise for. And it is a matter of adopting different strategies and support depending on the sector that you're in. So, human rights does get quite a bit of funding, in fact, but it is harder for them to adapt to different circumstances. And there is a caveat to consider, and that is to avoid mission drift, because what ends up happening in a lot of civil society across different contexts, especially in conflict affected or fragile contexts, is that they'll just sometimes shift their entire agenda to meet what they think are the donor priorities, rather than trying to reshape that to match what they think and what they know to be the community needs or so on. Sorry for the poor phrasing there. But that's something that requires more advocacy, in fact. And so in our project, we have a local network that we helped establish in the Eastern DRC in the Kivus. I can put the link to their sites on the chat. And so primarily what they determined, so in that project, we just gave them a lump sum of funds to say, okay, you can do what you want and what you think is important to you when it comes to organizational financial sustainability. And they decided to advocate on behalf of the rest of civil society in the Kivus about this issue, and went to meet and met, government officials and missions and different types of donors and funders, and had started shifting some of the behavior and breaking down that binary that underpins a lot of this animosity between donors and funders on the one side and civil society on the other, where they kind of blame each other for the problems, the structural problems that affects financial sustainability. And that way it's kind of bridging those divides and bringing those two and aligning their views and behaviors. So these are examples of things that we saw in terms of both our research and the piloting activities that we had.
Thank you. So perhaps Fred or Kath want to add, but I also suggest you if you don't mind thinking a little bit about, when you share your thoughts, what makes it easier or more difficult for CSOs to take up some of these opportunities? Because I've got a long list here, and they come down into different almost categories. But I'm just interested if, when Fred or Kath, you carry on.
Well, let me get maybe put a slightly different spin on it,
Sure.
or a different, which I think is practical. And I think a lot of our advice on fundraising with our partners is that actually with fundraising and thinking about your funding models and where you find different sources of funding, is you got to start with your product and actually what you do, what impact you achieve, and that's really a strategic question. So it's almost taking a step back and thinking about, I think a lot of times fundraising problems and challenges with funding models and the opportunism and chasing the money and those kinds of things that we're talking about, it results from an organization not actually knowing exactly what it wants to do, what it wants to achieve, what its core product and impact is, and who values that, because that's kind of where you start with your fundraising is what impact, what change are you bringing about, and and who values it? What's the market for that? Is it overseas funders? Is it government? Is it local communities, service provision models? Is it consulting? What is that value proposition for that core product? And a lot of times the reasons organizations struggle is because they're doing too many things. They're not doing them well. And there's a lot of strategic challenges to the nature of the work. So I think taking the step back, looking at your impact, your results, and thinking about how you market that is a really important thing. And also, again, another thing that we really emphasize is communicating around that, communicating simply, marketing your work effectively. Marketing is sometimes kind of a framing that we think of as being corporate and not something that civil society organizations do. But marketing is just talking about, the great work and impact you're achieving. And if you're doing that, then you need to talk about it in clear and simple jargon-free ways so that those who want to pay you to do it can pay you. Again, these are kind of starting points, I think, for maybe getting into a more tactical space around fundraising opportunities. And just another point I think to flag here, which has come up, but I think is really important in terms of thinking about the funding options is, this looking more locally and more domestically. And again, I think there's a lot of dynamics around the current situation with COVID that are perhaps are or will emphasize that. And, again, I think organizations really need to think about the value they deliver to communities, to their constituency. If they're a membership organization, if they're a service delivery organization, and I think as maybe Caesar or Charles had mentioned, that so often the fundraising is looking out and looking far away and looking at these kind of foreign sources of funding, but the long-term sustainability of organizations need to be tied to the value they're delivering to their constituents, and often I think the willingness to fund at that level is a lot greater than sometimes we expect in the civil society sector, and of communities to be able to mobilize resources. We've just been doing some work related to indigenous organizations in the Amazon, and we've heard how indigenous organizations that are strong, when they run into trouble, their community steps in and mobilizes funding and sells livestock or products or whatever they need to get that organization out of trouble every time. For those organizations that really have a strong mission and have a strong track record of, providing value to the community. I think if organizations don't have that strong community support and buy-in, they need to kind of interrogate maybe why not.
Great, thank you very much. Kath, would you like to add anything before we?
I do feel like people have covered most things. I really agree with what Fred just said about that link with your base and the importance of the strength of that link. I think there's a real challenge there in terms of the context. I was really interested by Caesar's case study and the experience that you've had in Kenya, and I'm feeling like in other countries it's somewhat more challenging to raise funding locally because of the instability. People are less willing to put money into to local organizations and so on, despite the fact that when we were doing research on funding for African organizations, twice as much money comes to Africa from African diaspora communities than it does from formal overseas development. And it's really important to recognize the contribution that families, that people around the world are making towards what's going on in Africa. That doesn't really get much attention. But when it comes to, I was really interested that Dimitri was talking about Eastern DRC. You know, that's a context in which people go, we're really worried about funding there because of instability. You know, we're not prepared to put funding in. So that's a real challenge that I think building trust and building confidence is one way of overcoming that. Another quite interesting way that some organizations have built themselves and built their own capacity is making links with, not necessarily with funders, but with research institutions, for example, and hosting students who are coming to do research. And so building up their own knowledge, but also having a bit more human capacity in the period of time that somebody comes and works with them to do research, to develop ideas that way. I think there's something there about finding creative ways of building the capacity without necessarily having a grant, but having human resources coming in and contributing something to the organization. While I've got the floor, I'm afraid I thought this meeting was an hour and I have another meeting at 12:30, so I am going to have to leave before the end, and I really apologize for that. But yes.
Thanks, Kim. Is there anything you'd like to say before you closed on? Just around any thoughts you have about what kind of mind shifts do CSOs have to make to take up some of these opportunities? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's a little bit, I can't remember which panel member was talking about the way that CSOs tend to get trapped into a certain model of how you have to get funding, how you have to report on it, and how your organization has to be structured in order to access funding. And sometimes that goes back to what Fred was talking about in terms of having confidence at the community level and confidence at the donor level. Sometimes those two are requiring entirely different structures and shapes, and it's about trying to marry those so that you remain faithful to the communities, the core that you're supporting, but you can account for it to the people who are funding it. And you're talking about accessing funding from outside. And to go back to the point that Dimitri was making with human rights type action, which is the sort of organization I've been more involved in, that becomes really important, because most of your funding is going to be accessed from organizations who aren't necessarily local. So I think it's being creative about how to marry those two priorities. Yeah, I think I'll stop there for a moment.
Thanks. I just wanted to. I'm not following the. Yeah, who's that, please?
No, it's me. I just wanted to add something to what Kath said. I thought very, very, very quickly. I think one of the things that we need to do much better is, which will help a lot when it comes to resourcing, is our stories, our ability to tell our stories in a very compelling and in a way that connects with our communities. So there's a lot of work that's been done, that we've been doing. And Fred mentioned that about our product. You know, there's a lot of impact that has been done in terms of civil society, but it's not been documented. The stories have not been told. And so it's very difficult for people to appreciate the work that we are doing so that they can actually become co-investors in the work that we are doing, especially those who are benefiting from this work and within our own communities in Africa. So storytelling, you know, our communications capacity, communicating our results in a vivid, in a vivid, compelling way, innovatively, you know, not necessarily through reports, because people really don't read those reports, but more visually, and, you know, working with, you know, the artistic sector, or, you know, those who work in creative arts, you know, film, music, you know, appealing to what the masses of our people really love, and to tell our stories I think will be a way that will help to build our local philanthropy, you know, because one thing that we're battling, and we've been talking about civic space, but it's also there's a trust issue, a trust deficit between us and our citizens in terms of our own organizations. So a lot of the time, our own legitimacy and relevance is being called into question for a number of reasons, right? So how do we bridge this trust deficit that we have? And the only way we can do that is to be able to share these stories and let the citizens be the ones to lead in the advocacy of the things that we're doing. I think if we do that really well, that will go a long way to ensuring that we are much more sustainable. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. There's something very powerful that comes through for the whole conversation is about identity. It's about being clear who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're connected at a very root and the boundaries of that, so you don't get mission drift, as Dimitri said. So there's something very important about building a clear identity, I'm hearing. Any other thoughts from the others about how CSOs may reposition their thinking? Go ahead, Dimitri.
It's not just only on local CSOs, but also some of the partnerships that they enter with intermediary or international organizations. I think there needs to be an entire rethinking around how to enter and exit effective partnerships. And that is having a co-design process from the get-go, not just aligning in terms of the allocation of responsibilities and activities and tasks, but also an alignment in values and building that kind of relationship so that when a project does come to an end with a definite, you know, a deadline or time that it ends, not to just leave immediately without, you know, having a responsible exit strategy in place, and, you know, gradually for an international organization that cannot necessarily maintain itself in that context, to be able to gradually exit in a responsible way that doesn't leave the entire work or the impact and sustainability of that work, doesn't put it at risk. And that's something that requires some rethinking in how you enter, but also how you think about, from even a very early stage, the exit of that partnership and how that will affect the sustainability of those activities on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So we've got about another 5-7 minutes. I'm just interested to invite anyone to share something that they feel they really want to get out there before we go to questions. Are there any other thoughts that you've been wanting to share? Because I know many of you prepared a bit. Anything else from you? Okay, so Mireille, we're going to need some help to find out what questions are coming through. I've been focusing on the panelists, so I haven't been focusing on the chat box.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could help by starting to share any of the questions that are starting to come through.
Yeah, thank you, Davin. I was looking at chat. There is not question in there, but I will ask people to raise your hand, you know, in the chat, as we have been doing in other sessions, so that we can give you.
Not in the chat, in the participant.
In the participant
list of participants.
stuff. So just raise your your hands so that we can take your questions. So I will start with Theodil, who has asked, and then Mary M. Kamanus. So we start with two.
Could you read them out?
Theodil first. Can you open Theodil mic, please? And then it will be Mary.
Go ahead.
Yes,
Theodil.
just a very quick one. I really liked Dimitri's point, especially when he mentioned the fact that we can do the staff's expertise. I think we should go further.
Please, Theodil, we are losing some
I think
time.
we should go further. In some organizations, what they have done was to allow the staff to do some consulting jobs because they know by doing so, staff will just be stable in the organization. You know, one of the crucial issues for all organizations, especially this one, is that staff tends to leave when there is no funding. And if you allow, oh, pardon, je parle plus.
Je disais, Théodile, que
Pardon.
ça coupe beaucoup, il faut être stable.
So no, I was just saying in a few words that organizations have to think in a very innovative way and make sure that the staff, for example, have possibilities to access their own funding, because by doing so they stabilize staff, and if staff is stable, then the organization will.
Yeah, Theodil, I think you're absolutely right. Staff retention is very much a key aspect of this for financial sustainability, and having more flexible structures in place for staff members to be able to outsource their expertise and so on can help them feel recognized for the value that they bring to the organization, and also to retain them in that organization and not leave them or have them get poached by others.
Thank you, Theodil. Mireille, the second question?
Danny, can you ask your question, please, Danny?
Oui, bonjour. Bon, c'est peut-être, mon idée a été déjà abordée par Théodile. C'est justement, je voulais comprendre un peu, si j'ai apprécié cette idée de vendre des compétences, parce que j'imagine que dans les organisations, il y a au fur et à mesure qu'on travaille avec les communautés, on développe aussi d'autres compétences. C'est aussi important de vendre ces compétences, et c'est en lien avec la fidélisation des membres. C'est-à-dire, au lieu que les membres soient débauchés, par exemple, par d'autres organisations et que l'on se retrouve perdant, d'une manière, on peut toujours capitaliser ça. Donc, c'est-à-dire que quelqu'un aille travailler, mais sachant qu'il y aura un quota et qui reviendra à l'organisation locale. C'est un peu comme des footballs où on pense toujours à l'équipe qui a formé et le joueur. Et voilà un peu, c'est une contribution tout de suite. Voilà, merci.
Merci, Danny. So, Danny, it was not a question, it was just a contribution. And yeah, I don't think, Isabel, you don't need to translate since he has talked in French. Have a little break too. Yeah, so he was just saying that organizations need to think like creatively on how they are using or how they are set up so that it leaves some time for people involved in the organization doing some stuff at the same time they're working for the organization. So they can go do consultancy or go for a short time working 3 months elsewhere, so that it doesn't create dependency on only one organization, and it provides kind of opportunity for that person to cover his fees, because many times the fees are the problem, you know, like there is no salaries or not regular salary. So that was Danny's point. I will give this essay to Salim. Salim, can you ask your question, please?
Oui, vraiment merci de m'avoir donné la parole. Ma question est celle-ci. En fait, c'est juste comme une contribution, mais c'est une question vraiment qui me préoccupe. En réalité, avant qu'un bailleur finance un projet, il y a déjà une étude d'évaluation de besoins qui est déjà faite. Et cette étude donne comme réponse, c'est-à-dire la capacité de partenaire à laquelle on devait lui apporter des financements. Alors, si on arrive à déterminer que voilà, la capacité institutionnelle des partenaires est faible, je trouve que ça serait très intéressant pour le bailleur qui opte à financer cette volet-là, d'abord de commencer dans un premier temps à renforcer la capacité institutionnelle de l'organisation à laquelle il veut apporter des financements et non de lui refuser, par exemple, de financement. Donc ici, je vois, ça serait très intéressant parce que l'expérience prouve que pour être une personne de qualité ou avoir une réponse très fiable dans ce que nous faisons, l'expérience prouve qu'il faut commencer à investir sur soi-même d'abord. Il faut investir sur soi-même. C'est-à-dire, voilà, oui, voilà, c'est un peu ça ma préoccupation. Donc, si les bailleurs peuvent focaliser beaucoup plus le fonds dans le cadre de renforcement des capacités de l'organisation d'abord, avant de procéder au financement, ça va être très intéressant. Voilà, c'est juste ma préoccupation.
Yeah, so the contribution from Salim was the fact that actually donors doesn't invest in organization. They fund a project, but they don't invest in organization. And that should be the first stage. If they are really coming in to support change and to make the change, then they would support organization to be more sustainable. So that was just a point from Salim. And je vois ta main, René. Tu peux poser ta question, René. Is there any question in the chat? René.
Allô, vous m'écoutez?
Oui,
Oui.
René, vas-y, brièvement.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je tiens d'abord à féliciter ce partage. C'était un partage très enrichissant. Ça reflétait un peu la réalité actuellement, ce que nous vivons. Et au-delà de cela, il faut aussi voir aussi les ONG de droits de l'homme sont beaucoup attaquées sur les questions de corruption parce que ce n'est pas facile. Et je pose la question pour savoir, la majorité des populations qui sont nos cibles, nos bénéficiaires, ne sont pas des intellectuels ou bien des illettrés. Au fait, ils n'ont pas été à l'école. Ce sont souvent des personnes qui ont laissé des études à bas âge et tout. Et comme on nous a parlé de la manière de communiquer, quels sont les outils techniques qui peuvent permettre à ces populations de mieux capitaliser l'information, de l'utiliser? Parce que nous venons avec des documents, des paperasses, parfois ça leur passe du temps, ils sont là, ils baillent, mais on a besoin des outils concrets qui vont leur permettre facilement de capter le message. Je ne sais pas si au niveau des conférenciers, on peut avoir des outils techniques au moins qui va capitaliser tout le projet ou bien l'instrument, le produit un peu quelque chose. Merci.
So, René, est-ce que, du coup, j'étais un peu perdue est-ce qu'il y avait une question spécifique ou c'est juste une demande des ressources?
Bon, ce n'est pas une demande de ressources. En fait, je demandais, est-ce qu'il y a une stratégie ou bien des outils techniques pour mieux véhiculer le message auprès de ces communautés qui n'ont pas été souvent à l'école? La majorité sont des illettrés. Quels sont les messages? Parce que souvent, ils sont perdus. On arrive et puis quand on revient, ils ne capitalisent plus ce qu'on a fait. Et on vient avec des paperasses. Donc, quel est l'outil? Un outil technique et tout ça.
Merci, René. So, René is just raising another problem of civil society organization not being able to support communities because of the language barrier. But then it's really bringing the question about, so that is my comment, that is not comment of René. It's bringing the question about then how can we, if we are a civil society organization, how are we representing a community, work with them, talk of them without being able to work with them?
Je me trouve au bureau.
Not being at school, they don't know how
Au
to.
bureau, je suis en bureau.
So it's bringing that guys, somebody in the panelists want to respond to that. So how do we support communities when they don't know to read and to write? So that's what I get from this question.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to respond to that?
Perhaps just as a clarification, from what I understood, he was asking for what kind of tools we might have at our disposal to support them in being able to communicate for better prospects for financing on their end. That's how I understood the question, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, because he said because they are illiterate, so they don't know to read and to write. So then how to communicate to them? So that's, yeah, thank you, Dimitri. So is somebody wanna respond to that? Have an idea of tools or? Not really. Not really, René. Maybe, René, tu vas rester un peu avec cette question-là et voir si elle va trouver des réponses ailleurs. Oui, Simba, c'est pour. Tu as une réponse à ça, c'est ça?
Il faut un peu de temps.
On doit activer ton micro. Tu as une réponse à ça, Madame Simba? Oui, vas-y. Il faut ouvrir ton micro.
Oui, bonjour à tous. Et juste pour essayer, moi, je pense que ce que nous avons fait, c'est de faire quand on est dans la salle avec donc le groupe en question qui est illettré, on pose par exemple des questions au choix et puis on leur demande de montrer leurs doigts s'ils sont pour une ou l'autre question. Et c'est comme ça qu'après avoir fait un questionnaire, répondu à un questionnaire comme ça, vous pouvez avoir l'idée des gens qui sont dans la salle, quoi.
Merci, Simba. Et je vois dans le chat, René, tu as une réponse dans le chat sur les images, les artistes, les journalistes, etc. So, Ali, can you please raise your question and then it will be Sekou Touré. First, Ali. Go ahead, Ali, please.
Yeah, hi. My question is, as Dimitri mentioned, that according to research, only 5% of the funding is going towards the financial sustainability of the organization. So does these research results also going, also getting attention of the donors, of the major donors or the governments who are actually investing, and or they taking it serious? Because if they have to work towards the international development, so obviously they have to go through these NGOs, INGOs. So this is, this current COVID situation is exposed over, the weaker system of the financial sustainability, weaker financial sustainability of these organizations. So do these donors all also concerned about it, and do they have any plan to do something about it? Yeah, and my other little question for Charles is, as you mentioned about the the alternative funding frameworks. I already see it's a challenge for many organizations just to keep for the fundraising and bringing the money in, and there's a conventional system of doing the proposals, and it will be like another challenge. Is it like that they have to go for a training for the fundraising to adopt if they decide to go for any alternative fundraising? Thank you.
I can try to answer to Mohammed's first question. To be frank, it's a mixed bag. So some donors have been a lot more open-minded and progressive when it comes to changing some behaviors around where to allocate certain funds. You can think of the Swedish International Development Agency, a little bit the GIZ in Germany, and a couple others. But there are it's a mixed bag because it's unfortunately the bureaucratic culture or organizational culture of some of these donors and funders is directly tied to the politics of that particular country. So, for instance, this project that we had worked on was funded by USAID. but this is via their local works department, which is almost an isolated department within the larger beast that is USAID. And to get their voices heard even internally within their organization is quite difficult. And then likewise in the UK with the proposition to merge the DFID, the Department for International Development, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, will actually detract from this potential change in behavior, because it'll be then seen through the prism of politics and national interests versus development priorities. So it is a mixed bag, unfortunately. And all of these donors that I mentioned have been privy to this information, but it's a long, it's going to be a long battle to be able to change some of the organizational behaviors across those bureaucracies.
Maybe I could add something, and especially how we've experienced it in Kenya. And the funny thing is that everybody, and I've also been in various other meetings, everybody will say that they have a localized kind of agenda or way of doing things, a bottom-up way of doing things. But at the end of the day, I think it translates to who has the resources. And so until there's a power shift to the extent that local organizations begin getting a little bit on from local sources, then it is very difficult. But of course, and then the other thing is how people are defining localizations. To some, it is giving unrestricted funding. And for me, I think those are the most converted. But to others, it is just changing the tune and the conversations. I've seen others who are allowing a bit of space during co-creation stage before the award of proposal, so that they listen a little bit more to what is coming from grassroots organizations. But I still champion an approach where different countries and organizations and chapters and associations of CSOs, where sometimes there's voice, and you see, you can't like lobby in the very extreme way, but you can create dialogue sessions where you begin pulling NGOs and other bigger organizations into conversations and realities. And like with KCDF, and I know with Charles, we are doing some work in collaboration with different actors. It's a question of trying to ensure that this particular conversation of localization is not driven entirely by people who control resources, but how do we increasingly ensure that we sit on that table and try to co-define what is a localized agenda, how does it look like, whose responsibility is it? Because again, it is still our responsibility as African CSOs, as much as we want other partners to join us. So I think it's a conversation, but I also think that we are at a time when many people are willing to listen, and that for me is a good thing.
Excellent.
There's something Charles wanted to say in response
to Mohammed's question. I think from what we have experienced is the greatest challenge in trying to make that shift to alternatives is the mindset. So you need to, as a collective, as an organization, decide at a strategic level that this is what we now want to do. This is something that we want to experiment with or pilot. We want to look at alternatives, right? Because you need a certain mindset, collective mindset shift from the way you've been operating as a traditional donor funding and all the attributes that come with traditional donor funding. And I think it's always important to start with a pilot. And you look at all the options that are available, and then you ask yourself, looking at what your organization does, your mandate, your ways of working, what would be the best model that you can start with in terms of a low-hanging fruit, in terms of a model that you can, basically transition into, right? But you can get a lot of this ideas from also visiting sister organizations or other organizations that have done this. So I'll just give you a story. Some years ago, my colleague and I actually had an opportunity. We had some work to do in Kenya, so we went to KCDF, and at that time, they were building their building that Caesar referenced. I think it's in Thika Road. They were building that. It is, yeah. So they were building that, and it was very interesting to see in terms of their approach. And we asked a lot of questions on why are you doing this? because there's a lot of investment, right? It's a huge multi-story building. How are you going about this? And why do you think this is a good way to go? And they gave us a lot of, interesting insights as to an asset building approach. And so that is something we also took back and have started almost something in that regard. We wanted to do crowdfunding for a specific project that we do. We visited an organization that has actually done crowdfunding. So usually what you do is go and find out what have been the challenges, what have been some of the difficulties. And then you take the learning from there and look at how you can apply it as a pilot. But one thing I want to say is that truthfully, in this short term, I don't see these alternatives replacing institutional funding in terms of quantum, if I have to be honest. But it helps with diversification, right? It helps to have different sources of funding so that you can be able to support, especially administrative and your own capacity building, right? But I don't see it replacing institutional funding in terms of the size. But it's always important for us to have alternatives so that we can be a little bit more independent also in making certain decisions and also a little bit more connected to our communities. So that's what I'll say.
Yeah, David, there is no more question in no more hands raised. So I think, yeah.
Okay. So I'm just wondering if anyone wants to have a closing comment or let people know that there are resources available, research findings, links, anything else you'd like to add before we bring this to a close?
Yeah, there is all the reports, those one from WAXI, from Peace Direct, from Well Grounded and Maria City. We have all of them, and they will be shared in the private group in Facebook and in private group on LinkedIn. So please join those groups, and you have all the materials that has been shared by panelists and speakers. Yeah.
Good. Any last comments from anyone? Fred? Lisa? Charles?
Yeah. Really nothing, but I think my parting shot would be as an organization, stand for something.
Cool.
Just a last thought. Yeah, that's a good. I think that's a good point for Caesar on the closing thought. I would say don't think so much about alternative funding models as healthy funding models, right? It's not like there's an alternative and there's just a new thing that you have to get into, but rather, think about what are some of the fundamentals that are going to enable an organization to have a healthy model for resourcing it. And I think that starts with impact and communications. As we discussed, it is critical to look at strong partnerships and move beyond transactional funding models, connect some funding to your base and to your core constituency. So I think really think through what are the fundamentals, not as if like there's something alternative, new and inherently different, but just doing things the right way.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Great.
Yeah.
Dimitri, any last comment?
No, I think that was said quite
okay.
smartly.
Thank you. Well, you've all been amazing. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for your contributions. I think this has all been recorded, so one can go back to it and see it. So I thank you all, and I thank all the participants for turning up. I hope you've enjoyed this. And I'm going to give it back to you, Mireille.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are getting to the close. So the next session will be at 2:30 UK time. So it is about crowdfunding. It's a French session. And then after that, there will be local resource mobilization. And this is the CDF. So just join us there if you want to continue this thinking and reflection and sharing. So yeah, thank you very much for everybody, and especially for Isabel, who has spent a lot of time translating. So thank you very much.
You've been amazing, Isabel. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Juste une discussion. Numéro. Tu ne peux pas. Mais je sais que tu as envie de parler. Allez, parti.
No? Yeah, you can speak, Steph, if you want.
I'm muted by the host. Thank you, Guillaume.
You saw that in the
Yeah, Argentina.
and Adam Smith and many others.
Yeah, I would say, like, would it be possible